Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to tackle something I think a lot of us struggle with, our kind of complex relationship with dopamine. And luckily for us, we have a great book that lays out this really helpful dopamine framework.
Yeah,
And it's not just about addiction, like in the way we typically think about it, with drugs and alcohol.
yeah,
It's about any behavior we overdo.
right.
It could be social media or junk food or even, something that seems totally harmless like romance novels. I mean, I know I get caught up in those
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah, I think we've all been there. One of the things that I find so interesting about this book is that it really shifts the way we think about addiction. It's not just a medical problem, but almost like this expression of our human drive to, seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Totally.
And I think that's a perspective that helps us understand why we get hooked on certain things, even when, logically we know they might not be good for us.
Yeah, like we're all wired for that dopamine rush, right?
Yeah.
And this book really brings that to life through the story of Delilah. She's a teenager in the book battling anxiety and pretty heavy cannabis use.
Right. And Delilah's story is kind of like our entry point into this whole dopamine framework.
Okay, cool.
And it starts with a D for data.
Okay,
So before we can even think about changing a behavior, we need to understand its scope. Like, how big of a problem is this really?
right.
And so in Delilah's case, she's using cannabis in many forms. Vaping concentrates edibles, and the frequency has, it's escalated over time.
So it's like taking inventory, right? You can't clean up a messy room without knowing what you're dealing with first.
Exactly.
Have you ever tracked your own habits, like how much time you spend scrolling through social media or watching TV? It can be pretty eye-opening when you actually write it down.
Absolutely. Awareness is the foundation of any change.
Yeah.
And so once we have a clear picture of the behavior, we move on to the O, which is objectives.
Objectives, okay.
So what are we hoping to achieve with this behavior? What's the underlying need that it's fulfilling?
Hmm.
And for Delilah, her objective is to cope with anxiety.
Makes sense.
She believes cannabis is the only thing that makes her feel better.
And that really resonates with me because I think we all have those go-to coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
Whether it's a glass of wine after a long day or binge watching our favorite show or even, working late into the night.
Right. We all have those things we turn to.
But here's where it gets interesting because the P in dopamine stands for problems.
Yes. And this is where we start to see the downside of those high dopamine behaviors, even the seemingly harmless ones. So, the author points out that Delilah's cannabis use, while providing temporary relief, it's actually creating a cascade of problems.
Okay.
Conflicts with her parents, potential health risks, and the fact that it's not a sustainable solution for her anxiety.
It makes you wonder about our own coping mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
Are they truly helping? Or are they maybe masking deeper issues? Like that late night work session might feel productive in the moment, but what's the cost in terms of sleep and relationships and, overall well-being?
That's a really powerful question to ponder. I think we often get so caught up in the immediate gratification that we fail to recognize the long-term consequences. And that brings us to the A in dopamine abstinence.
Abstinence. So are we talking about going cold turkey here?
Well, in a sense, yes. The author suggests a pretty bold experiment for Delilah, a 1-month cannabis abstinence challenge.
A whole month.
Yeah, it might sound extreme, but the idea is to give her brain's reward system a chance to reset and to see if her anxiety improves without the cannabis.
Interesting. So this abstinence period allows for the M in dopamine to take center stage, mindfulness.
Exactly, mindfulness. Withdrawal symptoms can be tough.
Oh, yeah.
And mindfulness provides us with a set of tools for navigating those difficult emotions and cravings without resorting to our old habits.
So it's about observing those feelings without judgment, just kind of riding the waves of discomfort instead of trying to escape them.
Exactly. You got it. I'm curious, though, have you had any personal experiences with mindfulness?
I've tried to incorporate it into my routine, but I can imagine that resisting those urges, especially in the beginning, can feel super challenging.
Oh, absolutely. It can be incredibly difficult. I can share an example from my own life, though, in those, early sleep-deprived days after my child was born.
I can only imagine.
Oh, it was tough. I remember struggling with these intrusive thoughts. One particularly unsettling thought just popped into my head late one night, and my instinct was to push it away, distract myself, anything to make it go away. But then I remembered the principles of mindfulness. So instead of judging myself or panicking, I simply acknowledged the thought. I noticed its presence, how intense it felt, and then I just let it go.
It sounds like you're able to create some distance between the thought itself and your reaction to it.
Exactly. And that takes practice, but that's the beauty of mindfulness. It helps us develop this greater awareness of our thoughts and feelings, giving us the space to choose how we respond instead of just reacting impulsively.
I wonder if our listeners have ever tried a similar approach. When you experience an uncomfortable feeling or a strong craving, do you try to fight it head on, or do you find yourself seeking that quick fix, that dopamine hit to make it go away? It's something to think about for sure as we continue our deep dive into the world of dopamine.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the insight.
Insight, okay.
Now, the big question is, did Delilah manage to abstain for a whole month? And more importantly, what happened when she did?
Welcome back to the deep dive into dopamine. So last time we left off with Delilah, facing this month of abstinence from cannabis, it was this challenge to kind of reset her brain's reward system and offer a clearer perspective on her anxiety.
Yeah, I remember. I'm really curious to find out, did she actually make it through the whole month? What happened?
Well, she walks back into the author's office after a month of no cannabis. And she's like a completely different person.
Really?
Yeah, her shoulders are relaxed. There's this genuine smile on her face.
Huh.
And she just declares, "Doc, my anxiety is gone."
Wow, that's amazing. It seems kind of counterintuitive, though, right?
Yeah.
Like giving up the thing that seemed to be helping her actually led to this breakthrough.
It's almost like when you have a splinter and you keep picking at it, you just make it worse and worse. Sometimes the only way to heal is to just leave it alone, let the body do its work.
That's a good analogy. So this is where the I in dopamine comes in, right? Insight.
Exactly. Insight.
So Delilah didn't realize how much her cannabis use was actually fueling her anxiety until she stopped. It's like she was self-medicating, but in the process, she was actually making the problem worse.
Precisely. And, this insight, it kind of highlights a really crucial point, I think. We often don't really grasp the true impact of our behaviors until we step away from them.
It's almost like we're wearing these glasses with a smudged lens, We think we're seeing clearly, but we're actually missing a big part of the picture. And then abstinence gives us this opportunity to kind of clean that lens and see the world and ourselves in a new light. I love that analogy. That's a great way to put it. And Delilah's experience wasn't limited to just her anxiety. She also reported all these other positive changes, like she had more energy, she had this more cheerful disposition, and she was even saving money because she wasn't buying cannabis anymore.
Wow.
It's like removing this barrier that was holding her back from experiencing life more fully.
It makes me think about what we might be overlooking in our own lives, right? Like, what if we tried a temporary dopamine fast from social media or junk food, or even just like our smartphones? What insights might we uncover about our own habits and their impact on our well-being?
Yeah, it's a really worthwhile experiment for anyone who's, seeking to better understand their relationship with dopamine. But Delilah's journey, it doesn't end with that month of abstinence.
Right.
It's important to have a plan for the future, and that brings us to end next step. So Delilah, she chose to continue abstaining from cannabis because it allowed her, as she put it, to be the best version of herself.
I love that. And it just goes to show that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, right? Whether it's continued abstinence or moderation or, something else entirely. The key is having a clear vision for how we want our relationship with these high dopamine behaviors to look.
Exactly. It's about making those conscious choices that are aligned with our values and goals rather than just being ruled by our impulses.
So this is where it gets really practical for our listeners, I think. What are your next steps?
Yeah.
Like if you were to make one small change today to kind of shift your relationship with dopamine, what would it be? Maybe it's deleting that distracting app from your phone or, swapping out that sugary afternoon snack for something healthier. Or maybe it's setting some limits on your screen time. It doesn't have to be this huge overhaul.
Right.
Even small adjustments can make a big difference.
And the beauty of the dopamine framework is that it really encourages experimentation.
Okay.
Which brings us to the final E, experiment.
Experiment.
And it recognizes that there's no single right answer. What works for one person might not work for another.
Makes sense.
And even for the same person, different strategies might be needed at different times in their life.
So it's more nuanced than just saying dopamine is bad, avoid at all costs.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking all about this dopamine framework.
Yeah.
And I'm ready to get to this last E.
Yeah, the final E is for experiment.
Okay.
And this is where we shift from just understanding this framework to actually applying it to our own lives.
Okay, so we've been talking about Delilah's success with abstinence, but does that mean everyone should, go cold turkey on all their favorite things?
Well, not necessarily. The author emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. When it comes to managing our relationship with dopamine, what worked for Delilah might not be the right approach for someone else. And even for the same person, different strategies might be needed at different times in their life.
So it's more nuanced than just saying dopamine is bad, avoid it at all costs.
Exactly. The author acknowledges that for some people, moderation might be a more sustainable path than complete abstinence. Like enjoying a glass of wine with dinner or catching up on your favorite show occasionally can be perfectly healthy as long as it's done consciously and it doesn't, you know, become problematic.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I imagine moderation requires a lot of self-awareness,
That'd be
honesty.
sure.
Like, how do we know if we're truly in control or if we're starting to slip back into those old patterns?
That's a great point because it's so easy to kind of fall back into those dopamine-seeking behaviors, especially when we're stressed or tired or just feeling vulnerable. The author even talks about this thing called the abstinence violation effect.
Okay.
And it describes how even a small slip-up after a period of abstinence can kind of trigger this cascade of guilt and self-blame, which then leads to a full-blown
Oh,
relapse.
I totally know that feeling. It's like, I already messed up. I might as well go all out.
Exactly.
One bite of a cookie turns into the whole bag. So how do we, like, avoid that trap?
It's all about, finding that balance, being honest with ourselves about our limits, and creating a plan that supports our well-being. Like if you know you have a tendency to overindulge in certain things, it might be helpful to set some really clear boundaries in advance. Like
Hmm.
decide how much is enough before you start, or create specific days or times when you allow yourself to enjoy those things.
So it's almost like having a budget for your dopamine. You
Exactly.
get to choose how you want to spend it.
Right.
But what if, like, our needs and desires change over time?
That's where the experiment part comes in. The author encourages us to use this whole dopamine framework as like a tool for ongoing exploration. Because our relationship with dopamine, it's not static, it's always evolving as we do. What worked for us in the past might need to be adjusted as our lives and circumstances change. Maybe a certain behavior was manageable before, but now it's starting to cause problems. The key is to stay aware and be willing to adapt.
So it's not about finding the perfect solution and sticking to it forever.
Yeah.
It's more about, like, developing this awareness of our own patterns. Right.
And being flexible enough to adjust our approach as needed.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination.
I like that.
And like any journey, there will be, bumps along the way.
Right.
But with each experiment, we gain these valuable insights into what works for us and what doesn't. Ultimately, it leads us closer to that balanced and fulfilling life we all crave.
I feel like this deep dive has really made me think differently about my own relationship with dopamine. It's not about demonizing pleasure or becoming some kind of joyless robot. It's about understanding these powerful forces that are at play in our brains and making conscious choices that align with our values.
I think that's a great takeaway. It's about reclaiming our power in a world that's constantly trying to, like, hijack our attention and manipulate our desires.
So for our listeners out there who are ready to embark on their own dopamine experiments, what are some key things to keep in mind? Well, first, remember, there's no shame in seeking help. If you're struggling with addiction or any behavior that just feels out of control, don't hesitate to reach out to a therapist or a counselor or a support group. There are resources available to help you navigate those challenges.
And for those who are just starting to explore their relationship with dopamine, be patient and compassionate with yourself. It takes time to unlearn old patterns and develop new habits.
Yeah, start small. Maybe pick one area you want to focus on, whether it's social media use or sugar intake or whatever it is for you.
Yeah, and remember, you are not your habits. You have the power to make choices that support your well-being and create a life that feels truly aligned with your values.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and tools to start exploring your own relationship with dopamine.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.